I'm looking at the first readings. Here we are in the Elijah-Elisha cycle, which is, I just love reading through these readings. And we didn't hear it yesterday because of the feast of Our Lady, Mary, Mother of the Church. But at that point, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah, and he says, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, during these years there shall be no dew or rain except at my word." And so he goes off, and God feeds him with birds bringing food to him. But then the stream where he's at dries up, and this is where we're at today. And so then he goes off to Zarephath. And we know it's something like 3 years, which you'll hear a little bit more about tomorrow, with the prophets of Baal. And but God providing for his prophet. And a lot of times we think that when God is asking us to do something, we look around and we say, well, that's impossible. Either we look at the circumstances out there, or more likely, we look internally and says, well, I don't have those gifts. You're asking me? What? I don't know. And I think about this, in my own life. I think about, I never knew how to do finances or administration or any of these things. And, as I've shared before, I had a deep fear of public speaking and all these things growing up. And yet I knew God was calling me to be a priest. And it's like, okay. And I remember the day that my father came up to me and says, "You do realize you're going to have to talk in front of people if you become a priest." I says, "Yeah, Dad, I know. I don't know what's going to happen." And yet God provided. He provided. At every parish where I have had to be a pastor, the Lord has given me great administrators. People to be able to take care of the finances and show me this is what needs to happen and lead me through these things. So even where I don't have the gifts God gives me, and the areas where He gives me people to do it, and the areas where I do need those gifts, He gives those gifts to me. And so often we think, well, do I step out in faith here? God is asking me to do something, but I can't do this. And yet He's saying, yes, you can. Not of your own, but by me. And a lot of times that comes, especially when we're called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, to go out and to shine God's love in this world. And we look at all the evil and how much people are oppressing our Catholic understanding of how the world is supposed to be and all these things. And we look and say, I can't speak up. I don't have the ability to debate or this other thing. And God's saying, but you're to be a light of the world. And darkness may not like it, but you're called to shine my light in the world. And we may not have the gift of being able to debate, and that's okay. But we are called then to be witnesses of God's love. I was listening to a podcast by Chris Stefanik yesterday. Or Chris Stefanik? No, not Chris Stefanik. Someone else. What's his name? I don't know. Matt Fradd, that's his name. Matt Fradd, he was talking about how when he was younger, he was very much anti-Christian and, just laughing at people, and making fun of people for going down their Christian road. And he says he was first evangelized by Christians, non-Catholic Christians. He was on a plane one time, and this guy sitting next to him, they got into a conversation, and he had mentioned that he was a Christian, and he said, "Well, how did you become a Christian?" And he said, "Well, I was a drug addict, and I couldn't get out of it. I was just so full. But one of my friends said, 'Come to church with me.' And he went to church with him. He says, 'I'll pray over you.' And they prayed over him. And he says, I was free of the addiction to drugs." He said, at that moment, he said, what was I supposed to say? "Oh, you're stupid for being a Christian." He says, you don't say that, oh, yeah, that's stupid, because it was the witness of his life. And that started to draw him in, and then eventually he became Catholic and a great evangelist in the Catholic Church. That we don't necessarily need to have the ability for rhetoric or whatever, but we are called to be a light in the world, a salt to the earth, to live by our lives in such a way that they would make no sense if God didn't exist. And while this isn't something we can do on our own, we can cry out to God and ask Him for that grace. Lord, it's impossible. It's impossible. I only have a handful of flour in my jar and a little oil in my jug. I don't have the ability to do these things. Lord, what are you asking of me? He says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Trust me. Follow me. Do what I ask. And the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour shall not go empty, nor the jug of oil run dry, until the day when the Lord sends rain upon the earth, that God will take care of our lack. In fact, I get the impression by looking at the saints and the history of the church that God prefers to work with people who are impoverished in so many ways, to show the greatness of His might. May we step out in faith where God is leading, and even in our mistakes, even in our failures, even in our emptiness, in our poverty, to trust that God will lead us if we only are striving to do as He says, to be the salt of the earth, to be the light of the world.